Hello and welcome to a special kind of video, which maybe could look a little bit familiar to you, because if you remember, after the last year's World Championship, I did an analysis of which leaders and wonders had the most and which ones the least appearances in my World Championship games, and I thought maybe it could be interesting to do the same again, maybe taking a look at if things roughly stayed the same or if there are maybe some big changes compared to the last World Championship. And yeah, so we will again take a look at what leaders and wonders had, how many appearances in my World Championship games from this year's World Championship. However, this time we won't do a quiz to this. If you remember, we did a nice quiz last year. This time I decided to do it without it, but we will still take a look at the yeah, leaders and wonders count of this year's World Championship for me. However, as a disclaimer, and I think I also said it in the last year's video, I don't think there is a lot of knowledge or valuable data to be gained from this little analysis. I think the amount of games is just not big enough to draw any big conclusions. It's mostly just for fun to see maybe some tendencies in my personal game style or play style, but no, you can't. The leaders and wonders that have been picked the most often don't necessarily have to be the leaders and wonders that I actually think are the strongest, because maybe some leaders and wonders are more contested than others, and then there are multiple reasons why maybe I got a leader or wonder more often than the other. But nonetheless, I think it is maybe fun to take a look at this again. And now, without further ado, we can start. And first of all, we can take again a quick look at the amount of games from this year's World Championship. And that is actually relatively similar, at least for me, the amount of games compared to last year. This year I played 56 games in total. I didn't have to play in stage 1, but from stage 2 on I had to play every stage. And in the last year World Championship we had I had 54 games, so 2 games less on 2 games more that we have now. So in the last year's World Championship we had a bigger final with more games, but I had to play one less stage before, so the amount of games is relatively similar. So the numbers are maybe also relatively good to compare to each other from both World Championships. And then from those 56 games, there were 21 two-player games. And as you can see, I actually won 19 out of those and draw 2 of them, which I think is quite a nice outcome. And the player count where things went quite a bit more badly for me are the 3-player games, interestingly, because in the last year's World Championship, the 3-player games were definitely one of my best player counts, but this time I won 9 of the 3-player games, finished second in 7 of them, and lost 5 of them. So the 3-player games this year were a bit of my problematic player count, but the 4-player games have gotten better. That one was the most problematic player count in last year's World Championship, but this year it was quite solid with 14 games only, but 9 wins, 2 second places, 3 third places, and no last place. So overall, I think a relatively nice outcome for me. Overall, I think I'm also happy about my third place in the World Championship. And yeah, the most problematic player count in this year's World Championship were the 3-player games. And now we will start taking a look at the leaders and wonders, and we will be starting in HA with the leaders, and like the same like in the last year, we will start with the leaders that are in the bottom half from top to bottom, and then we will take a look at the leaders in the top half from bottom to top, so that the most exciting things are maybe revealed the latest. And when we start at the bottom half, we actually have the same leader there as last year, and that is Alex. And first of all, we can maybe tell you what those numbers mean. The first number, the 3, means that Alex in this year's World Championship had 3 appearances. Then the numbers in the first bracket show you which player counts Alex appeared in. So the first one are the 2-player games, then the 3-player games, then the 4-player games. So Alex appeared in 1 2-player, 1 3-player, 1 4-player game. And then the number in the second bracket is the number of games that Alex appeared in the last World Championship. So you see, so that you compare how things maybe have changed. And Alex was actually in this exact same position, and had also this year again 3 appearances. Not the most, but or there are definitely also leaders with less. But there are some more leaders with 3 appearances, and one of them is Cleopatra, also with 3. Then we have a leader with 2 appearances, and that is actually Caesar. who also had 2 appearances in last year's World Championship. So far you might be thinking, why are we doing this video? Everything has stayed exactly the same, but I can promise you there are also actually quite some big upsets coming, where things have changed quite drastically. But Caesar, I had him in 2 games. I'm not that I don't go for a military heavy playstyle in the early game that often. Sometimes I do, but I think that is here reflected with Caesar only having 2 appearances in the 56 games of the World Championship. And then we have another leader with 2, and there we have the first change because Homer actually appeared only 2 times in this year's World Championship, while last year he had 5 appearances. So he dropped down a little bit. And also interestingly, in 4-player games where I maybe would consider him the strongest, I didn't have him a single time. So Homer didn't really have that many appearances this year. And then at the second last position, we have another one of the military leaders, Sun Tzu. I had him in 1 2-player game, so not really a lot of appearances. Sun Tzu might be maybe my bit of a weak spot for me, or a blind spot, because I think, especially when you remember the World Championship finals, there Sun Tzu had some successful games where the player with Sun Tzu actually won at the end, especially Marta Pecheur, the new World Championship, used him very nicely. So maybe I have to value him a bit more highly, or maybe just play him a bit more often and get more used to playing him and see how I can generate value out of him, because that might be a little bit of a blind spot for me. And he had only 1 appearance, and in the last position with not a single appearance, and I think he also was in the last position in the last year's World Championship, is Moses. Last year he at least had 1 appearance, but this time I didn't have him in a single game, which is of course not that great for Moses, but hopefully there will maybe be some Moses games coming in the future again. Then in the top half, we have Ashoka with 4 appearances, so very solid, all of them in 3 and 4-player games, where I think he is stronger than in 2-player games. Then we have Hippocrates with 5 appearances, who had 4 in last year, so stayed relatively equal. And then the top 4 leaders actually stayed the same compared to the last year's World Championship, but while last year they all were on different positions or had different amount of games where they appeared, this time all of the top 4 leaders are tied. All of them had 9 appearances, and those leaders are Hammurabi, Confucius, Boudica, and Aristotle, interestingly. So out of those 4 leaders, Aristotle had the biggest rise. Also, by the way, if there are multiple leaders or wonders with the same amount of appearances, I will just order them alphabetically, so there is nothing else to it. Just ordered alphabetically, and Aristotle was already quite nicely. Had done a quite nice amount of games in last year's World Championship, but this year he is together with Boudica, Confucius, and Hammurabi on the top of the HA leaders. And we can again see that in HA I really like some leaders that generate me some economical value and especially some science, because Boudica will maybe most of the times take science. Only Hammurabi is a leader that doesn't produce science, but he of course has the very strong ability to give you an additional civil action at the cost of having one military action less. Last year, Confucius was the single best HA leader. This year, he has to share his spot with 3 other leaders. And then we can go to the HA wonders, and in the bottom half we have a wonder that only appeared in 1 single player count, but they are relatively often, and that is the Acropolis, who had 5 appearances, all of them in 2-player games, and that of course makes some sense because it is completely very strong 2-player games, can be fine in 3 and 4-player games, but I actually didn't have it in a single one of those player counts. So all of the appearances are coming from 2-player games. And then another wonder also with 5 appearances is the Colossus, that more split into the different player counts. And last year Colossus had 4 appearances, this time 5 appearances. And then on the bottom we have 2 wonders that I don't go for that often, and in the second last position we actually have the Hanging Gardens, which at least had 2 appearances this time. Last year they had 0 appearances, and it means that the Hanging Gardens this time isn't on the bottom of the list of the HA wonders. Instead, the Colosseum is with only 1 appearance. Yeah, so the Colosseum is also just a wonder that I don't go for that often. mostly if I go for it, maybe in 4-player games. As you can see, that was also the one game where I appeared in, but 4-player games is also the player count that has the least games in the current format of the World Championship. And with that, maybe it didn't have that many chances to be taken in those 4-player games. So those two are the wonders that I clearly maybe take the least often. And then we have the top half of wonders, and the first one is actually the library. Maybe a little bit surprising. A lot of players maybe value it as one of the top wonders of HA. It still had a very recent or relatively nice amount of appearances with 7, but it is actually only at the 4th position on the list. And on the top of the list, like with the HA leaders, we again have a very big tie. 3 wonders are sharing the top spot, also like with the HA leaders with 9 appearances. And those wonders are the Stonehenge, interestingly, Roman roads, and the pyramids. So the pyramids last year's clearly dominated the HA Wonders with 13 appearances. This time it only has 9 and has to share its top spot with the Roman roads and the Stonehenge. The Roman roads definitely had an improvement, and as you can see, the Roman roads had 6 appearances in 4-player games, so almost as many as the other wonders combined. And it's maybe also there's some truth to it. I think in 4-player games it's definitely the player account where I value the Roman roads the most. Interestingly, the pyramids I didn't have in a single 4-player game, but that was maybe had more to do with me not having the chance to take it, because I also like the pyramids quite a lot in 4-player games. And interestingly, the Stonehenge with more appearances than the library, maybe I just more often had a chance to take it. I think if both library and Stonehenge are available for me, sometimes maybe I will go for the Stonehenge, but maybe in more games for the library. So maybe the Stonehenge was just less contested than the library, and with that had 9 appearances and is on the top together with the Roman roads and the pyramids. And with that we will go to the next age, and we'll start with age 1, and there at the bottom half we have actually a bit of a surprise for the leaders, and that is actually Saladin, who last year was the second most picked leader from me, but this time he is actually in the bottom half. But there are actually a lot of leaders with 5 appearances. Some of them are also displayed in the top half, so still a reasonable amount of appearances, but a bit surprising that maybe Saladin didn't have more of appearances, because I like him quite a lot, and it's just such a versatile leader that you never go wrong basically if you take him. He always will offer some nice benefits. And so a bit surprising that he only has 5 appearances, and the other leader had already a similar amount of appearances in the last year, and that is Jan Žižka. Last year he had 4 appearances, now he has 5, so he has improved a little bit, but is still in the mid of the field from the H1 leaders. Then next we have maybe an even bigger surprise, and that is Barbarossa, because if you remember the last year, Barbarossa was not only the most picked leader from me in H1, but actually together with Bach the most picked leader from all ages in the last year's World Championship, and now he has rise from the top to not the bottom, but almost, with only 2 appearances in this year's World Championship. I don't really know why this happened. Maybe the 10 appearances from last year was just a lot more than than the average I go for him, and this year it was maybe just a lot less. But no, Barbarossa not having that many appearances. There's another leader with 2 appearances, but that one actually improved a little bit compared to last year, and that is Genghis Khan, who had at least 2 instead of only 1 appearances in this year's World Championship. And then we also have another leader with 2 appearances, that is Gutenberg, both of them in 2-player games, where he is maybe the strongest, but overall also not really that many appearances by him. And then the leader on the bottom is a leader that I actually thought that I have gone for him more often recently, but maybe those games weren't the World Championship games, because this leader is Michelangelo, leader that has great potential, can be very, very strong, but maybe also not that easy to predict how much value he will generate. I think I have definitely grown on him and will go for him more often, but in the World Championship games of this year, I actually had him only one time in a 2-player game, and I think that game was actually part of the finals. So, Michelangelo is on the bottom of the field. And then in the bottom of the top half, we have two leaders that serve maybe nicely as colonization leaders. First of all, we have Isabella with 5 appearances, same as last year, and then also Eleanor, a leader that either can serve maybe nicely as a transitional leader, but also, of course, as a potentially as a colonization leader, and has also improved her appearances a little bit compared to last year. Then with 6 appearances, we have next Leonardo, who had appearances in all of the player accounts, very equally divided, and yeah, just I had him a very solid amount of times. Then the next leader in the list is Nostradamus with 7 appearances, one more than in the last year, and then we have 2 leaders with 8 appearances. The 2 top leaders from last year, Saladin and Barbarossa, both aren't there, and this time we actually have Joan of Arc and Columbus, both with 8 appearances, and for both of them quite an improvement, especially for Columbus. And yeah, I think for Columbus there's maybe some truth to it. I think I'm now even more inclined, maybe compared to a year ago, to even go for him when I don't have a colony in hand, if I have already a strong HA leader, just with the chance to draw one, especially if I have maybe already an early additional military action. I sometimes will go for him, even with having no colony in hand, just because he is such a nice transitional leader, especially when there's a Suez Canal in the game, and with that, I actually had him a total of 8 times this year in this year's World Championship. And also Joan of Arc has quite a nice amount of appearances. Then we can go to the H1 Wonders, and there we have on the bottom half the Machu Picchu with 3 appearances, a little bit less than last year, but I think last year it was already maybe one of the surprisingly often picked wonders. This year it is maybe on a spot where it is actually where I maybe would have seen it, with 3 appearances, 2 of them in 2-player games, interestingly, and then we have some other wonders with 3 appearances, and one of them is actually the Taj Mahal. In last year's World Championship I didn't pick the Taj Mahal a single time, but this time it got picked 3 times, so that's definitely not bad. And then another wonder with 3 appearances is the Great Wall, which has a lot of potential, but is also a bit costly with the 4 steps, and maybe a bit conditional, because you want to have maybe at least some infantry units when you go for it, but has a lot of potential. Maybe I should go for it more often. Actually, all of the appearances were in 3-player games. Yeah, but I at least had it 3 times, and that means that we have 1 wonder on the bottom with only 2 appearances. And in the last year, that wonder wasn't on the bottom, but it was basically only the case because the Taj Mahal had 0 appearances, and this time the Himeji Castle is actually the 1 wonder that was picked the least often, with only 2 times, both of them in a 2-player game. And now I have maybe a little bit grown again on this wonder, but it isn't really that much represented in its appearances. Yeah, so far, or for this year's World Championship, that is actually my least picked H1 wonder. And then we can go to the top half, and we have 1 more wonder with 3 appearances, so a total of 4 wonders with 3 appearances, and that wonder is the Forbidden City. Last year it had 4 appearances, this year 3, so not a lot of changes. Then we have 1 wonder with 4 appearances, and that is the other Happy Face Lucian wonder, the St. Peter's Basilica, with 4 appearances, 2 in 2-player and 2 in 4-player games. It stayed the same as last year. As you can see, now all of those wonders have relatively low numbers so far, meaning that maybe the 2 upcoming wonders have quite high numbers, and that is indeed the case, because the wonder at the 2nd place has actually improved in the amount of times that I've took it, but still got 1 place down in the list, and that is the Universitas, which I had picked 10 times in this year's World Championship, 1 more than last year, but it is still in the 2nd position, because the one in the 1st position had a very big rise. And you probably know which one it is. It is actually the Silk Road with very, very big amount of 14 appearances. So as you can see, my love for Silk Road has doubled compared to last year's World Championship. I took it not only 7, but this time 14 times, which is a really, really big amount of games. And if you maybe wonder if my Silk Road love is a little bit too big, maybe you're right, but actually when I took a look at the outcomes of those games, in all the 2-player games where I had the Silk Road, I was able to win, and also in all of the 4-player games, I think, where I had the Silk Road, I also was able to win. So it didn't disappoint in the result. unless apart maybe from the 3-player games where I actually had, I think, 2 losses and second place with the Silk Road. So very interesting that I actually go for the Silk Road that often. Maybe it's not that much contested by other players. Probably I value it a bit higher unless I'm playing against Marta Pecheur than my opponents, and so maybe I just get more chances to pick it, and maybe it just fits my playstyle very well. Yeah, but that was definitely very interesting that the Silk Road actually got picked that often this year by me. And now we can move forward to H2. And in H2 we have a very, very big upset at the top of the bottom half, because in the bottom half the wonders are actually picked very, very less often, or very very rarely. And the wonder that we will see first was actually the second most picked wonder in the last year's World Championship, and that is the Oh, sorry. We are, of course, the H2 leaders. I was already talking about the H2 wonders, so you have to be a bit patient. Maybe I think I already said the first syllable of the wonder, so maybe a little spoiler, but we will start with the H2 leaders, and the first one is James Watt with 4 appearances. So just relatively solid, most of them interestingly in 4-player games, while maybe you could think it is more, he can be more valuable in 3-player games with because there you more often miss out on iron and will then go for coal, and also there are 2 copies of oil for 3 players, but interestingly I had him the most often in 4-player games. Then we have some leaders with 3 appearances, and we have another James with James Cook, who has improved his amount of appearances by a little bit. I had him a little bit more often. And then last year we have another leader with 3 appearances, that is Darwin, also relatively similar to last year. And then we have Newton, who is maybe a little bit surprisingly that far down the list. Last year he had at least 5 appearances, and that already I thought was relatively low, but even though I like Newton a lot, I didn't take him that often in the World Championship games. Then on the second last position we have a leader with 2 appearances, who also was quite a lot better in the more often picked in the last year's World Championship, and that is Napoleon, who has only 2 appearances in this year, but 5 in the last year. And actually the 2 appearances where I had him were 2 3-player games. In both of those games I lost, so Napoleon didn't really bring me a lot of success in the 2 games that I had him. Maybe I just don't that often go for a big military push in H2. I mean, I sometimes will, especially if I have all my economy already covered and can then maybe disrupt my opponents. But at least in this year's World Championship, maybe I rather went for him when things were maybe looking already not that great, and I needed him as to make sure to not fall behind military. Maybe that then leads to the 2 losses, but no, he in general didn't got picked that often by me. And the last leader was a little bit of a surprise for me, not a big surprise, but definitely a leader that has a lot of potential. So I was surprised that Robespierre actually was only picked 1 times, maybe because I like it a lot to go for a lot of science production most of the times, as you can see with my HA leaders that are on top, and with the Universitas and the Silk Road being built very often by me. Maybe I then just have often enough the science, more often than not, the science to just go for a government form peacefully and don't need Robespierre. But especially if you are low in science, Robespierre can be such a strong leader and make a very big difference on how the game will be progressing for you. But for me, he only had 1 appearance in this year's World Championship. Then in the top half of the leader, we will start with Catherine, who had a very solid amount of 5 appearances, interestingly 3 of them in 2-player games. And then we have 3 leaders with 6 appearances. 2 of them actually had already 6 appearances last year as well, but 1 of them not, and that is Shakespeare. And as you can see, all of the 6 games where I had Shakespeare were 2-player games, and I think all of them I also was able to win. So Shakespeare just extremely strong in 2-player games, and a lot more difficult to set up in 3 and 4-player games. But overall, still he has been picked quite often. Then we have we have 2 leaders with 2 more leaders with 6 appearances. One time Nobel, who also had already 6 appearances in the last year, and in contrast to Shakespeare, he was not picked a single time in 2-player games, because playing him against those big cultural leaders can often not really lead to a very good outcome. And then we have Maria Theresa, who many of you thought maybe was the most picked leader from H2, but again, like in last year, she got picked a solid amount of times, but not enough to make her the top leader of the age. And then we have one leader that appeared 7 times and has improved in the amount of appearances quite a bit compared to last year, and that is Anthony Gaudi, which I'm very happy about because he of course represents the profile picture of my channel, so it's of course nice that he also got picked a lot more often now in the last year's World Championship. I had him 7 times, a lot of those times in 2-player games, and last year I only had him 3 times, and then the top leader is the same as in the last year, but with a bit less appearances. It is Bach, but instead of 10 times, I only had him 8 times this time. And actually, interestingly, a bit divided over the player counts. I think last year it was a very big amount of 2 and some 3-player games, but this time it is a bit more divided. But he is still the most picked leader from H2 because it's just very easy to set him up and then maybe get some culture generation out of him. And now, after the H2 leaders, now we will come to the H2 wonders. And I already teased a bit that there is a very big surprise, and I think maybe I already said too much, so we won't any longer delay revealing it. It is the Harvard College with only 2 appearances, which really surprised me. A wonder that I actually value quite highly, but interestingly, only picked 2 times in this year's World Championship compared to the 8 times that I picked it in the last year. So a very interesting surprise. With the 2 appearances, this actually tied with another wonder, the Kremlin, who has a little bit improved compared to last year, but still was picked relatively rarely. And then the top are the wonders on the bottom. Maybe you can guess them. It is the Eiffel Tower with 1 appearance, and then the Louvre with again 0 appearances. I think there are definitely situations where it is nice to go for the Louvre. If I remember it correctly, I also got beaten by the Louvre by Marta Pecheur in the final, so you shouldn't stay away from that wonder completely, but yeah, I personally don't go for it that often. Should maybe consider it a little bit more. I think I also had some games where I went for the Louvre recently, but those weren't World Championship games, and so in the World Championship games, the Louvre still remains my least picked wonder overall, with having 0 appearances in both of the recent World Championship editions. Then we will go to the top half of the list, and there we have, relatively similar as last year, the statue with 4 appearances in the 4th position, and then exactly similar as last year, the railroad with 7 appearances on the 3rd position, so a very solid amount of appearances. And then maybe remember in the last year, the ocean liner service was by far the most picked one in H2 and also my most picked wonder overall with 15 appearances. So now it will be interesting to see, has that stayed the same or is there maybe a bit of change even? And surprisingly, the ocean liner service this time shares its spot on the top with another wonder, and that is the Suez Canal. Both the Suez Canal and the ocean liner service have been picked 10 times. So this time I wasn't able to go for the ocean liner service as often. Maybe not because I didn't want to, but because I just didn't have that often a chance to take it. But interestingly, I managed to pull the Suez Canal off quite often with 10 appearances. Last year, that was the big surprise, and from the H2 wonders with having only 3 appearances. So basically, what Harvard does this year, Suez Canal did in the last year. But this year, Suez Canal is actually 10 appearances. To be fair, I think a lot of those appearances, maybe 3 or 4, were actually in the first stage that I played against relatively weak opposition. I managed to win all of those games, and maybe in such a game it is a bit more easy to set up a colonization game, especially when there are some players that don't really bid that high for colonies. Maybe a lot more colonies get seeded without there being a really clear plan how to win them. So maybe that takes things a little bit into perspective, but still really nice total amount of appearances for the Suez Canal, and the ocean liner service got a little bit more down to earth in this year's edition and didn't have such a big amount of appearances. And now we are already entering H3. We will start with the H3 leaders, and in the bottom half we have Sid Meier with 4 appearances. He has improved a little bit. Interestingly, 3 of them were in 4-player games. Yeah, but if you have computers, which is nice to have in 4-player games to build a strong economy, then there's Sid Meier coming down the row. He can be a very solid choice, and this year it happened 4 times that I went for him. Then we have 2 leaders with 3 appearances. One of them is Marie Curie. She was a bit better last year with 6 appearances, this year only 3, but still at least some appearances. And then the other leader actually improved by quite a bit, with also being into 3 appearances, and that is Steve Jobs, who I actually had not a single time in the last year's World Championship. This time he at least had 3 appearances. Then I had this year 2 games where I had Gandhi, meaning that most of the games I maybe mostly didn't really need him to hide behind, or maybe just got destroyed with the military anyway. And yeah, only in 2 2-player games I this year I made the decision to go for Gandhi. Then in the 5th position, there's a leader that very surprisingly had 0 appearances last year. I think that was for me a surprise, but also for a lot of you, because it's just a very versatile leader that doesn't really require any big setup, but maybe also just doesn't have the biggest ceiling unless you're going for a lot of military. Then he definitely can be quite strong. But also in this year, Churchill actually had very few appearances, at least 1 appearance compared to the 0 from last year, but still very interesting that I actually go for that leader that rarely. And then, now that we are slowly entering the end of this short analysis of my Leader and Wonder picks, we have maybe one of the biggest upsets still ahead of us, because there's one leader on the bottom that I actually didn't pick a single time. Maybe you can pause for a moment, think which leader could that be? And the answer is, that leader is actually Bill Gates with 0 appearances. Already in the last year, it was quite a bit surprise for some of you that I only picked him 2 times. This year, I actually picked him 0 times. And it doesn't really have something to do that I don't really like him that often, that much. I think he can be very, very strong, but maybe he's also more contested. Yeah, it's very interesting that I actually didn't have him in a single game, because if I have some labs and Bill Gates is coming down the road, it's definitely a leader that I will often go for, but maybe those situations just didn't happen that often. Now we will go to the top half of the leaders, and there we have Einstein, same as Sid Meier, with 4 appearances, all of them interestingly in 3-player games. And maybe I would have expected him to even be a bit higher up the list, but 4 is at least a solid amount of appearances. Next we have Mandela, who has a bit less than last year. Last year he was the 3rd most picked leader. This year he's the 5th most picked leader with 5 appearances. Then we have 2 leaders with 6 appearances. Both of them are some culture leaders, and both of them had the most appearances in 2 and 3-player games. And those leaders are Fleming and Chaplin, both with 6 appearances, and most of them in 2 and 3-player games, where maybe they are the strongest and can just generate a lot of culture. And then we have 2 leaders that are clearly the best, similar to last year. And the best leader of last year from age 3, or the most picked leader from last year in age 3, is only the 2nd position this time, but actually with the same amount of picks, Marlene Dietrich, where I picked her 9 times, 6 times interestingly in 2-player game, but with going for some theaters very often in the player count, it of course makes sense that you have her maybe that often. And then in 2-player games, and she was very consistent amount of picks, but because another leader has improved even more in how often I had him, she only is at the 2nd position this year. In the 1st position we have Pierre with 10 appearances, a very big number, 2 more than last year. And if you have arenas, he's just generating a lot of culture, can maybe make you a little bit safer from war with the Olympic Games, and that is just a lot of value. And often it is maybe worth it to go for arenas just because Pierre's in the game, and just because it is such a nice option in the late game. And so I had him a total of 10 times. And now we can go to the age 3 wonders. And on the bottom half we have a wonder that was maybe the biggest surprise in the age 3 wonders last year, because it was actually my 2nd most picked wonder. This time it is a little bit lower, but at least still picked 4 times, the Empire State Building. If you have a strong economy, that can just be a very big and very nice way to generate some culture. Also only takes 1 civil action, which sometimes can be an advantage. And with that I picked it 4 times. Then we have 2 wonders with 3 appearances that were last year on the bottom with 2 appearances. This year they both of them have improved by a little bit, and those wonders are the Red Cross and the Manhattan Project, both with 3 appearances and also exactly the same in which player counts they appeared how often. And then we have one wonder on the bottom, which was a little bit better last year, the United Nations with 2 appearances compared to the 4 that it had last year. And with that, it's the least picked wonder from this year's World Championship. And in the top half, the numbers are definitely going up, and interestingly, there's one wonder that has improved quite a bit, and that is the internet. Last year it only had 2 appearances, but this year we actually see it with 7 appearances. However, one thing has to be said about that, and that is that I think 3 or maybe even 4, I think it were actually 4 appearances out of those 7 were in the first stage of me playing the World Championship again against some maybe weaker opposition, where it was just relatively easy for me to build up big economies with lots of urban buildings, and then of course out of the sudden the internet is just a lot stronger of an option than maybe compared to games against very strong opposition, where you can't that easily build a lot of stuff, and that of course helped the internet, but still, nonetheless it got picked quite a lot more often. And then we have a wonder that is just always solid, but never that great. But it still is solid enough to pick it very often, and it is the fast food chains with 8 appearances, 3 more than last year. Most of them in 3 and 4 player games, because in 2 player games you very often maybe try to go for big Hollywood or internet, and then the fast food chains maybe sometimes can't be good enough or is not good enough. But in 3 and 4 player games, it's just a very solid option sometimes. And then for the top wonder, we have 2 wonders that have 10 appearances. One of them was on top already in the last year, one has improved by quite a bit, and the 2 wonders are the Spaceflight and the Hollywood. Spaceflight has had 9 appearances last year, this time even 10, lots of them in 3 player games. It's just similar to the fast food chains in that it is almost never really bad unless you had a really few science production. But in contrast to the fast food chains, it's maybe more easily possible to also make it relatively big, make it score maybe close to or even more than 30 points, an amount of points that you can't that easily get out of the fast food chains. And so it is maybe because of that it got even more often picked by me. But this time it has to share its top spot with the Hollywood, which I mostly had in 2 and 3 player games, also very often in the first stage of the tournament. I think in almost all of those games, or maybe in 6 or 7 out of the 8 games from the first stage, I had either the internet or the Hollywood at the end to score me a lot of points. That helped the Hollywood to be on the top spot, but still it also in the stages after that got picked not that rarely, and with that shares its top spot together with the Spaceflight for the H3 wonders. Now we are through all the ages, but now it is of course still interesting to see which are actually the most picked leaders and wonders overall, and we will take a quick look at that now. And for the top leaders, we have actually 5 leaders that had 9 appearances in my World Championship games, and those are 4 from HA, Aristotle, Boudica, Confucius, and Hammurabi, and then 1 from H3 with Marlene Dietrich. All of them had 9 appearances. And then we have 1 leader on top that you just saw a moment ago, and that is Pierre, the only leader with even 10 appearances. And both of the leaders that had the most appearances last year, Bach and Barbarossa, are not even in the top 6 this year. And Barbarossa, as you remember, had even a very big downfall with only having 2 appearances in this year's World Championship. So here we have a change for the top leaders, and we also have a change for the top wonders, because there we also have a lot of wonders with the same amount of appearances, with 10 appearances. Actually, 5 wonders, same as with the leaders. We have Universitas, Suez Canal, Spaceflight, Ocean Liner, and Hollywood, all with 10 appearances. But we have one clearly best wonder, and that is, interestingly enough, the Silk Road with 14 appearances, which is the new Ocean Liner service. The Ocean Liner service still had a very solid amount of appearances this year, but not nearly as enough as last year. And the Silk Road this year I had almost as often as I had the Ocean Liner service in the last year, so a very big number. And and the Pyramids, who were by far the second most picked wonder from last year, was still picked relatively often with 9 times, but not enough to be in the top 6 of the most picked wonders overall. And with that, we are through with taking a look at the appearances of the leaders and wonders. I hope it was interesting for you to see what how things have maybe changed a little bit. As said at the beginning, that was mostly just for fun, maybe seeing a little bit of tendencies. For example, me going for the Silk Road 14 times definitely showcases that my love for the Silk Road has even more grown over the last year. And yeah, maybe you can write in the comments which were maybe the biggest surprises for you. What was maybe very unexpected for you? Was there something that really caught your attention? Then definitely write about it in the comments. And then thanks for watching. It will probably be the last video for me in this year. So I wish you all a very nice Christmas and a very nice start into the new year, at least for all of you where the new year will begin at a time. That of course is different in some regions, but for all of you who will celebrate entering the new year, I wish a new year, and of course to all the others as well. And yeah, then thanks for watching, and then see you in the new year.